Welcome to Trust the Badge.
Today, Mr. Steve Kellams, a retired law enforcement veteran, joins us in this episode. Mr. Kellams served in various roles throughout his 30-plus years of municipal policing in Indiana, from patrol officer and sergeant to lieutenant and captain of administration. Known for his dedication to training and onboarding new officers, he became passionate about teaching and has traveled across the United States to share his expertise on field training programs and law enforcement practices. Since retiring in 2019, Mr. Kellams has continued to make a significant impact through his Blue Canary Podcast and professional training services. Join us as we dive into his remarkable journey in law enforcement, his insights on current challenges, and the importance of effective training for the next generation of officers. Welcome, Mr. Steve Kellams.
My name's Steve Kellams, and I retired from law enforcement after 30 years. I worked in municipal law enforcement in Bloomington, Indiana, which is a city in south central Indiana, home of Indiana University. So college town. I was going to IU. I went through the police academy and graduated from there in 1989. Spent a couple of years while taking classes at IU, working as a part-time officer for the IU Police Department before joining on the Bloomington City Department. I was there for 27 and a half years. And my career there was typical for municipality. I spent 10 years as a patrol officer, working night shift, dealing with the things you'd expect to deal with in a college town. Then I moved into supervision, became a sergeant, worked all of the shifts, moved into detective division, worked narcotics enforcement, some undercover work, worked into general assignment detective, dealing with major crime scenes and homicides and things like that. Then was promoted to lieutenant, made my way as a lieutenant, working on all of the different shifts before finally becoming captain of administration. And my job there was internal affairs, public information, hiring, recruiting, accreditation, basically all the stuff nobody else wanted to do. I got to do all of that. And then I retired in 2019. But when I retired, I had spent much of my career teaching as a field training officer. So doing onboarding for all the new officers that come onto a police department. Most departments typically will have some kind of onboarding or training. And I did that. I started doing that very early on in my career. And I spent, like I said, I'd been on for about a year and a half when they made me an FTO. And so I trained a lot of new people coming on the department. Throughout my career, I managed to supervise the field training unit. So when I retired, I basically took all those skills and I started teaching. And now I travel across the United States. I teach agencies all about field training programs, onboarding, teaching adults and new officers basically how to do the job. And that's what I've been doing full time since 2019. And I've had a blast doing it.
Could you explain what encouraged you to join law enforcement?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that I go back to my father. My father was a pipe fitter. But he really, I honestly don't know where his desire came from because it was nowhere else in the family, but he got involved as a reserve officer. And in the state of Indiana, where I grew up, the reserve officer programs, and they have those across the United States, they're different in different states, but they're volunteers who join the police department. They get a little bit of training and then they put on uniforms and they go to work and they do things like county fairs, basketball games, football games at your local high schools, traffic direction, any of the extra kind of work that needs to be done as pure volunteers. And my father did that. So I think growing up, I saw that and it was kind of in the back of my mind. I don't know that I ever looked at law enforcement as a career. As a matter of fact, I went to IU to be an astronaut. And then I realized you had to do math. So the next best thing I figured was police officer. When I got to IU has a wonderful program like most major universities. And, this is one of the things that when I heard your story really got me interested and I reached out to you was the view that a lot of people have of police officers and that career. And, a major university like IU is just like that. They had criminal justice programs, but nothing that really knew about law enforcement in the United States. They knew about, they could tell you what was going on in Sweden. They could explain why one set of pygmies kills another set of pygmies on the other side of the mountain. But they had no idea about law enforcement in the U.S. However, they do have a program at IU unlike any other program in the United States. And that program is a part-time police officer program. While a full-time student, you get to go through the entire Indiana Law Enforcement Academy and work as a part-time officer for the university. So I spent
Wow.
one full summer there. Yeah, one full summer there. I went through the academy. I got certified as a police officer in the state of Indiana, and then worked as a part-time officer while taking classes at IU. So that is what really hooked me. Like I said before with my father, that was definitely in the back of my head. But once I saw that program, I applied for it. I was accepted. And then when I got into it and started doing it, I was like, this is what I want to do. And then the moment I started, I never backed away from that.
That's really interesting because that's the first time I've heard of a program like that, especially in many communities such as mine. There are Explorer programs where as a teenager from the ages of 13 to I believe 18, you can join the program and experience what it's like to be in the shoes of a police officer. Did you have the same duties as a normal police officer during that program?
You did. So
Okay.
after the academy, a sworn officer carried a gun. We did. It was really kind of the part-time work. I describe it as getting a good view of what law enforcement is without really having a clue, because you did football games and basketball games as security, and you did traffic direction at the university events. You did some dorm patrols. So we did make some arrests, mostly like alcohol or small drug arrests, fighting, things like that. But you were kind of on your own, but there was always a full-time officer somewhere nearby that was supposed to show up and help if you needed. So it really gave me a good view of what law enforcement was going to be like. So it wasn't like the Explorers, and it wasn't like a lot of cadet programs that you see at a lot of universities where it's purely security based. No, we had full law enforcement powers. And so it was a really good introduction to law enforcement. And like I said, doing it really, I got bit by that bug.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that you got to experience that and got to share with us today. What about the field training program? Could you just expand on that and why you're so passionate about teaching other officers, why it's so important?
Because I wasn't taught very well.
Okay.
That seems horrible, and I don't mean it as such. It's kind of a flippant
Okay.
answer, but it's the truth. When I came on, we did have an FTO program, or actually, let me back up a little bit, because I've had such great experiences in my career, and that's usually what I try to share when I teach. So I went through that police academy program at IU, like I just talked about. So I graduated from that at 20. At the time, you could do it at 20. Now you have to be 21 years old. But I graduated from the academy at 20. And so I'm at college, and I graduated, and I come home for Christmas break. And when I got home to the little small town in Indiana where I lived, the town marshal basically came and knocked on the door. And I answered, and he said, "Hey, I heard you went through the police academy." And I said, "Yeah, I did." And he said, "Well, did you like it?" I said, "Yeah, it was really cool." And he goes, "You want a part-time job?" I said, "Doing what?" He said, "Town marshal." And I'm like, yeah, of course. I mean, what else would you say, right? I'm a young kid getting offered the opportunity to do this. You bet I am in.
Right.
And so he said, "Great, you bring your stuff with you. Come on down to the town hall tomorrow. We'll get you sworn in. And while you're home for Christmas break, you're going to be a town marshal, and you're going to work in this little town." And so that's what I did. The next day I went, got sworn in. And as I walked out of that swearing in ceremony at the town hall, I walk into the parking lot where the town marshal hands me basically the keys to the police car. The police car's sitting there. He hands me a piece of paper that has a phone number on it. He says, "Hey, I'm going to be in Florida for the next 3 weeks. If you have anything, just call me." And he left. I literally, that day, I'm by myself patrolling, a 21-year-old kid just out of the academy, zero experience, and now I'm patrolling a small town in Indiana. It was some of the
Wow.
most exciting and terrifying time of my life.
For sure. Yeah.
And so I
Wow.
took that, that experience was amazing. And I'm like, okay, so then I get hired on the Bloomington Police Department, and they had a field training program, but by that time, the program that they had kind of fallen apart. It wasn't very good. The trainers weren't trained. Nobody really knew what they were doing. And so you kind of drove around, and they showed you stuff. And if you were lucky, you had somebody who cared and tried to teach you. But just as often, you had somebody that didn't care and didn't try at all. And so most of my things that I learned on my own. Then when I became an FTO, I realized how much I wanted to share with new officers coming on how to do the job. I wanted to help them. I wanted to share my information. And the more I did it, the more I loved it. And I just kept doing it. A lot of people are FTOs for short periods of time, then they go do other things. But I love teaching, and that's become my second career now. And so the FTO then is just something that I learned, and I spent so much time doing, and I'm really passionate about it because and I know that you've talked about this on some of your shows and had people on, we have to have reform within our profession. If you're not reforming, you're dying. You've got to be innovative. You've got to be reforming. You have to be changing, and that's where we should be. And the way you reform law enforcement is with your new people. And I tell them in my classes all the time, if you do the job of an FTO, a field training officer, well, there's nothing finer you can do with your career. Because if I train the next generation of officer to be a professional ethical officer, where will they be in 3 or 4 years? They'll be doing the job I'm doing, training the next generation. Then that same professional ethical officer I trained in 5 or 6 years will be a sergeant on the shift and a supervisor. Then they'll be in the operations level, making those bigger decisions. Eventually they'll be a chief or sheriff, and you've fundamentally changed your police department. And that effect on your department will have that effect on your community. So field training, to me, is one of the most important things you could do at your department. It's the only thing that makes a difference, and it's why I'm so passionate about it.
No, I can tell. You're very passionate about field training. I've read your LinkedIn bio. I've read your experiences. You have been in field training for a long time, and I can tell that clearly that one experience where the marshal's like, yeah, here's the keys, deal with it. Did you have any issues within that time period? Because you had to teach yourself everything, right?
Yeah, yes, the academy gave me a lot of those basics, and
Okay.
really I had to learn how those basics applied in the real world. And no, I didn't have any real issues at all. It was a very quiet little town. It was, and I got to do a few things. I remember particularly with a very small, and this is, we talk about rural police officers too, because these are the type of things we need to be teaching all of our officers, whether they're in the big cities, whether you're in New York City, whether you're in Chicago, Denver, Houston, doesn't matter. You can be in some very small Mayberry somewhere, and you need to know these skills. Because I remember the entire county when I was working there were only 3 officers in the entire county working at night. You had one in the county seat, one officer working in that town, at an evening officer. There was one sheriff's deputy working the road that night, and then me. And the state police were already off. Nobody was working. And I remember that the deputy in that small town or the officer in that small town called for assistance. And I had to drive emergency response about 25 minutes all the way to the other side of the county to try to get there. Didn't know where I was going. And that was a big deal. And we still see that today. So having those kind of challenges and things like that is like I said, I learned from all of that, but I do have to say nothing major happened. And I guess that's kind of like, well, that's law enforcement in general. We typically succeed in spite of our training, not because of it. Because we don't get enough training. We're not where we should be. And so it's just a testament to the good men and women that are out there doing this job day in and day out, that we actually make it work, even though we've not been given the tools to do that.
Right. That's a really good point. What do you think of the events going on today? So as you see, there's always a headline. A police officer shoots an unarmed person, right? And then it comes down to, was this officer trained properly or not? And when you see these cases, what really comes to your mind? Do you think it's mostly that they didn't get the proper training, or was it their instincts that was wrong?
It's a difficult question because there are a lot of layers.
For sure.
What I typically say is that the community expects us to be surgeons, but they train us like plumbers.
Okay.
And there's nothing against a plumber. You have to know this certain kind of type of skills, but as a surgeon, you can make no mistakes. There's no chance for any mistake. You must be perfect, and you must be perfect under extremely stressful, difficult situations. And the idea is, instead of training us like that, they give us minimal training at best. They expect us to be able to go out and do things under highly stressful situations, rapidly evolving circumstances, and we cannot make any mistakes at all. So the training we should have should be reflective of that. When you look at a surgeon, the amount of training that they get to do that job is extensive. Years of education, years of training, years of residency before they're ever going to be out there on their own doing it. Look at most cops in the United States. 640 hours of a police academy. There you go. Knock yourself out. Oh, and you can't make any mistakes, and you have to do it perfect. And it's just not reasonable. So the problem then, to me, is training. And so the question is why? It's time and money. It costs money to do this, and you have to have staffing to do this. And so then we start getting into a lot of issues with, your local politics or politicians that aren't necessarily supporting that. They have other agendas that they want. They're not getting the monies that they need in, and they need bodies now. And again, there's 800,000 police officers across the United States. And when we see that thing on TV, it's the one thing, right? It's that single incident that happened that we focus on. And what's funny is we're going to talk about doctors, right? When you talk about doctors, if we were having a podcast about doctors, we would never say, most doctors are good, but of course there's a few bad ones. We never say that. But we always say that when we talk about cops, don't we? Absolutely. We're going to talk about good things about cops, but there's all these good cops out there, but there are a few bad ones. There always are. But we never do that about any other profession. And it's because that not only do we have issues of training, but the perception issue, the PR issue. We've been in a PR battle, public relations battle with people like Hollywood for decades, and we've been losing badly. And so I love people like you that are out there trying to tell stories so that the normal people can understand what it is we do, why we do these things, and that, like I said, we're succeeding because of the great people that are doing this job.
One of the reasons why I started Just a Badge, I'm not sure if you know or not, but it's because two main reasons. One, I volunteer at my local police station, and from there I saw the distress through sitting at the front desk, right? It was inside the mall, a shopping mall, right near the entry and exit, and it was the community police station. So through the window, I could just see people walking in, walking out. I saw all the reactions. One of the reactions I saw was just mind their own business. The other one was, oh, cool, police station, let me take a picture and leave. And then the third one was just seeing the word police and then turning the other direction or just running past it so you don't be seen by police officers. And that really hit me. I was like, there's no way people actually believe that they should be scared of the people inside that building who are there to serve and protect them. So that was one of the reasons. The other reason is, as we were just talking about those specific incidents, after the George Floyd incident, which was on national television, every headline, there was no voice for law enforcement at the time, just none. It was all damaging law enforcement. They were defund the police movements, the Black Lives Matter movement, and it was only damaging to law enforcement with no voice for them to speak up. And that's when it hit me that the people who are here to serve and protect are not voiced at all, which is why I started Trust the Badge, to give law enforcement a voice as someone who has a connection with law enforcement. I think that the more we have conversations like this, the better, because most of the time we see that the officer who was involved in the George Floyd incident was absolutely in the wrong. But does that mean every single other officer in the nation would do the same thing? Absolutely not. I think that's something that most people should start to understand is law enforcement they're just humans. They're not superheroes. A lot of people, like you were just talking about, they expected them to be surgeons versus being trained as plumbers. That's a really good analogy, because the way I put it is a lot of people think that law enforcement should be superhumans who can do everything correctly. But in reality, they're just the same as us with a different task. I think that should be spread a lot more.
Yeah, I heard someone say, and this was something else that stuck in my head, I wish I could remember who said it, is that the problem with police officers today is we still have to hire from the human race. So
that's a good one.
I thought it was excellent, because we still have those flaws. And I did a lot of recruiting and hiring at my position as a captain. I had a 100-man police department, and in 3 years as a captain, I hired 43 cops. So that's a huge turnover. Wow. Of course, this is 2019. The George Floyd incident was simply building upon Ferguson and some of the other social unrest we've had. The defund police movement and Black Lives Matter was heavy. And so lots of turnover, lots of hiring. And I always said that I didn't hire cops. I hired good people. My job is to turn them into cops. And to do that, I need to provide proper training, motivation. They need to understand why. And that's the other thing I talk about, is understanding the whys. You have to know why we do this job, not just how. A traffic stop. Most people are really good at teaching or training traffic stops or building searches, but they do a terrible job of teaching why we actually come to work every day, put a uniform on, and go out and protect people that don't particularly like us or even want us there. But we do it day in and day out, no matter what pressures we have, no matter what hate we get, we still do it. And you do that for love. You love your community, you love your families, you love the people that you work with, the people that you live with, the people that you go to the grocery store with. That's the only reason you do this kind of thing. And that's what makes policing so special.
The other thing I want to point out is I found very ironic. The same people who wanted law enforcement to be better trained, which I completely agree. You should be training law enforcement more. And as given your experience as well, I'm sure you do as well. But the same people who believe that law enforcement should be trained more are the same people who were advocating to defund the police. But how are you going to train them if there's no funding? It's just like a double-edged sword. It doesn't make much sense. But what are your thoughts about the defund the police movement? It's happened in the past few years, or just it was very viral just a few years ago. It's died down slowly. But as you've seen, the repercussions are terrible. There are so many terrible results across the nation on many police departments that I can name off the top of my head right now. But what do you think about it?
Well, it's funny because a lot of people, and I like yourself, didn't recognize that the defund police movement didn't start in 2020 with the George Floyd incident. It didn't even start in 2016 with Ferguson. This thing started decades ago and has been going on for a long time. It's just that with the George Floyd incident, they were no longer afraid. They took their masks off. They started marching in the streets, demanding it when this stuff had been going on in the background. And as you pointed out, the results are why we're at epic crime right now. It's why violent crime is extremely high. It's why there's that war on law enforcement officers, and there is a war on cops. But people don't like us to say that, but there is.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
That is specifically because of some of these defund police and decarceration programs. There's a book, Criminal Injustice, by an author, Rafael Manguel. Rafael Manguel is a phenomenal researcher in criminal justice. And I bought the book just because I could have all of the quotes in it, all of the criminal justice research, which that destroys the defund police movement. And I wish I could do it justice. I can't. So I always point to that book when people kind of ask me, is Criminal Injustice by Rafael Manguel, just a phenomenal book that breaks down all the problems with it. And a lot of it is a knowledge issue. We kind of know on our side in law enforcement, because we haven't been telling our stories and because we've not had people out there kind of fighting for us, we allow media to do it. Well, media has somebody on that's a defund police advocate, and they say all cops are racist. And the person in the media goes, okay. And they just move on. It's like, wait a minute, time out. Where do you get that from? What study shows that? How are you proving this? You can't say that, you can't walk outside at noon and say, oh, it's dark out, it's nighttime now, and just everybody go, okay. Yet that's exactly what happens. Most of the movement has had some serious problems. They make statements that absolutely aren't true. The stop and frisk in New York City, one of the greatest stop and frisk programs in New York City, is one of the greatest anti-crime programs that has ever been created, and it worked phenomenally well. It wasn't racist in the slightest. However, a lot of the anti-police and defund police movement, they went after it. They created circumstances. They had people come in, and it's all public knowledge that most of these people they had testify were not telling the truth. And all of a sudden, you can't do that anymore. So, and again, another program that if you bring up, most people are like, oh yeah, that's terrible. Yet when you actually find out the truths behind this, you realize that there is so much great work that was done out there that we are not allowed to do anymore, not on behalf of the public, but it actually harms the public.
For sure. And could you just touch up on the war on police right now? Because I've heard that term so many times. I follow the National Fraternal Order Police, and I've seen that term, war on cops. What is that? And could you explain why that's viral right now?
It's so particularly when you look at law enforcement officers assaulted or killed in the line of duty, and you can go back to the early 90s. I started my policing in the early 90s, actually late 80s. And that was a very violent time for law enforcement officers. And a lot of times they'll point to that time saying it was more violent for law enforcement officers then than it is now. But there's a lot of things that are left out of that statement. Statistically, that might actually be accurate. However, first off, our the medical technology has improved 100-fold since then. The officers carry on their belts things today that we never had back in the past that are saving lives time and time again. So the fact that officers aren't dying necessarily at maybe the rate they were back in the early 90s does not mean that the violence isn't through the roof against law enforcement officers. It is.
Sure. Yeah.
The other issue we see is back in the early 90s, whenever I was out there doing the patrolling, when cops were getting killed, it's because we got in the way of criminals. We stopped a criminal that was committing a crime. We stumbled across some type of crime that the criminal was committing. And the response to that was officers were getting killed. And it was a horrible thing, don't get me wrong. Today, people are actively hunting law enforcement officers. Today, there are people that are literally waking up in the morning, going out and trying to find a cop to kill. And that is very different than what we used to see. That is a war on officers. It is a war on cops. And the other thing is, if you resist a law enforcement officer, if you fight them, if you kill them, you become a hero. You become a hero. The media loves you. You will be on TV time and time again. They will drop your charges. We have in Indianapolis just recently, we have a man that murdered a law enforcement officer. Bria Leith was murdered when she responded to a domestic violence call. And the judge sentenced him to the minimum amount of time in prison and included time served, so that he is going to get out for doing an absolute minimum rate for being found guilty of murdering a law enforcement officer. So the defund police movement, back to that, and the war on cops isn't just our bad guys trying to kill us. It's the politicized prosecutors and judges who have gotten into the court systems. And now I've had prosecutors tell me, it's your job to be assaulted. Well, that's ridiculous. It's not my job to be assaulted. Yet many of them think that that's your job. As a cop, you put a uniform on, you have to be ready to be assaulted because that's your job. Absolutely not. It's ridiculous. But they think that way and they adjudicate that way. And we end up with criminals running the streets. And today, those assaults on officers are incredibly high because people that should be behind bars are not.
That's terrible. There are people waking up every day.
We could talk about that topic for hours. We could talk about that for days. There's so much going on there, but and it's, again, it's the concerted attack against our profession. Also, that's something else that I'll say. It is the defund police movements. It is the decarceration movements. The fact that prison populations right now are almost half of what they were in the early 2000s. And if you look at crime rates at 2008, prison population was about 2.5 million, I believe. Right now, it's about 1.3 million, 1.2 million. In 2008, it is statistically the absolute safest time we've ever had in our country. Locking people up works, and it lowers crime. But see, these are the statistics that they don't want you to know. It's the media doesn't like to talk about this because they have their other agendas.
We've seen it many times before. The media just pushes one side, especially when it comes to law enforcement, and it's hurt so many law enforcement agencies across the country. I mean, I bring up this specific example because it hurts so much to know that this is real. But when the defund the police movement happened, one of the police stations that was affected was the one in Burlington, Vermont. It's a small city in Vermont. What happened was the city council decided to cut funding. And by cutting funding, they were going to lay off a good amount of police officers. Not too many, but just the right amount to their standard. And when that happens, not only did those police officers leave, but way more than that left because they felt disrespected and they felt discouraged from ever working at that police department ever again. They weren't being supported. Next thing you know, next year, crime rates skyrocketed. Even the simplest crimes increased because there was just no police officers there to defend the community. And when the time came, the city council was struggling and panicking, not knowing what to do. So as we see now, recruitment and retainment is one of the hardest things for police departments after this movement. So if we could talk about that, could you touch up on police recruitment and retainment?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first off, I think the key here, and it's what I've been trying to tell people, is stop recruiting and start retaining. Keep your people. Don't push them away. Too many, if people didn't leave, I wouldn't need to hire as many. But so many cops are leaving law enforcement. And I go right also back to a typical leadership statement. People don't leave companies, they leave leaders. And so what we have is an epidemic of poor leadership in public safety, which means officers don't want to stay at these agencies and they're going to leave. Now, there are some agencies out there that have great leadership. And you're seeing them actually reap the rewards of this. They're having a lot of people hiring on their department that are leaving major cities and big areas because of the lack of support, as you talked about with Burlington. And we've seen that time and time again across the United States, and where there's just no support. And so people leave. And so if what we need to start seeing is departments really start focusing on the people they have. How can I build family environments and atmospheres here? I need to improve my leadership. I need to show support for these officers. And I really want them to make them feel like they're something special, a part of the community. And then I need to compensate them appropriately for the job that I expect them to do. And not just compensation monetarily, although that's fantastic, but making sure they have enough staff, enough manpower to do their jobs, that they can do them safely, and that they're not having to work mandatory overtimes and 60 and 70-hour weeks because the department is making them. And that's what we're seeing across the United States right now. So retaining people is number one. The next thing we have is recruiting. And I think that's really important, because the problem we have in law enforcement is our vision of recruiting. When we talk about finding people, I ask most people what budget they have at their police department for their recruiting. And I know that you're not in law enforcement, which is why this conversation is awesome, by the way. I love this. How much money do you think your local police department is spending in recruiting new officers? What do you think their budget is for a year?
Okay. For my community, I'm in Florida, so we have a strong police state here. For recruitment alone,
Yeah, just recruitment. What's the budget for recruitment?
I'd say maybe 50,000.
Ooh. Oh, okay. I would bet you, I don't even know what county you're in. If they have a recruitment budget for recruiting, I'm not talking about the salary of someone that they have in the recruiting, but the money
Right.
the money that's set aside so they can recruit, I'd be surprised if it's 5,000.
Wow.
Most agencies, I'll tell you right now, 90% of the police departments across the United States, their budget is zero for recruiting. I had a 100-man police department. I hired 43 officers in 3 years. My budget for recruiting was zero. The people I had assigned to recruiting, zero. I had to do it myself.
That's
What I tell
insane.
people is it is insane, because last year, Google spent $1 billion in recruiting, 1 billion with a B. So the point I try to make to most police agencies is that we love to say we have a recruiting problem, but that's because we're trying to recruit like it's 1970. We expect, though, to be a line of people on our door knocking, wanting to be cops. Today, with the anti-police movements and the way Hollywood is, nobody wants to be a cop. They don't realize it. What I'm telling people is there are a lot of people out there that would really love to do this job. They just don't know it yet. We've got to go find them. And finding them is to get rid of the traditional recruiting plans. Let's start spending some money. And you do see some agencies do this. Seattle is putting up big billboards across the United States trying to recruit. New York City also is spending some money trying to recruit. So there are some agencies that recognize this problem, but the vast majority of them are still recruiting like it's 1970. So go out there. We need to find these people, and we need to bring them in and show them. And that's why I love teen programs. Is something else. You talked about Explorer programs.
Right.
I think those are tremendous programs. The program that got you involved, that walked in the door. And I know that you're going to college right now, and I don't
Yep.
know what your future holds, but the more I think you find yourself dipping your toe in this law enforcement, the draw is going to be there. It's going to be very interesting, because there's phenomenal people in this. Most people don't know that yet. And then finding young people like yourself that are interested in this, that are willing to take a few minutes to listen to what we have to say and to show them, man, being a part of something as special as protecting your community and your fellow citizens, I don't know what better there could be to do. And so that's the recruiting element that we have to do, is we have to, as a profession, really start embracing the concepts of recruiting, as opposed to just hoping they'll show up.
Recruiting right now is, I'm sure you can agree, but that is the most important things that police departments can focus on right now.
Oh, yeah.
Because police officers are being lost at a significant rate. Luckily in Florida, however, we have the bonus program. I'm not sure if you know about it or not, but in Florida, if we get an out-of-state police officer to move here and become a police officer in Florida, I believe they get a $5,000 bonus. So that's
Yeah.
really
There are
huge.
bonuses, and this also goes back to some of the retaining. And I know Champaign, Illinois, for example, has a $20,000 bonus for officers. Now, the beauty of that is, this is something that I also will argue about. Many departments will pay a bonus to new officers, but if you hired on the police department and you've been there for 2 years and you've worked really hard and you didn't get a bonus, and they'll just hire a guy brand new and give him a huge bonus, that kind of makes you feel bad. I think it's like Comcast Cable, right? We'll give you a great deal when you start, but after you've been a member for a while, your rates go through the roof, and you have to quit and then come back to get that good deal again. It's almost like that. And recruiting is, we're trying so hard. And this is why I say stop recruiting and start retaining. We're trying so hard to bring in new people that we abuse our old people. Well, let's first take care of our old people, then let's go get new people. And what Champaign, Illinois did, they offered a $20,000 bonus to any new police officer that came and took a job there. But they also paid a $20,000 bonus for every officer that was working there at the time. So it's like, okay, all right, you're taking care of your people first. And I think that was good.
That's definitely a program that I think other states should look into as well. I mean, Florida, I think we're doing pretty good, but other states where they need it, I think they should invest in it, because right now retaining and recruiting is one of the hardest things.
Well, you're absolutely correct. Florida is one of those states that, as you said, it's pro law enforcement typically for the most part. They have, they're well funded. Your sheriff's departments are very strong in many of those communities down there. And so what we see then is a lot of people and the out-of-state draw. They really like out-of-state, and a lot of the agencies don't have age limits. So a lot of the municipal police departments have age limits. You can't hire someone if they're, if they're not in the pension fund. You can't hire them if they're more than 40 years old, say. Well, you're seeing a lot of people that are putting 20 years in an agency in northern states, and then they're retiring, but then taking a cop job in Florida and, getting paid there and getting all the bonuses from that while they work another 10, 15 years. And so, Florida is definitely one of the states that is benefiting from some of these other states, the mass exodus of law enforcement in some of these other states.
We have very good law enforcement here. We're pretty well funded. It's just in other parts of the nation, I wish they could say the same. To change over the topic, could you explain why you started the Blue Canary Podcast, right?
Blue Canary? Yeah.
Blue Canary, yeah. Yeah, we didn't get to talk about that. Yeah. Could you explain why you started it and what inspired you to?
Yeah. It was teaching. So I retired in 2019 and I started teaching full time. I had been teaching for about 20 years before that. But it was all my time off and my vacation time that I could spend. So then once that was taken care of, or once I retired, I basically turned on training full time. And my first year, I think I had about 42 classes that year. So almost every week of the year, I am traveling somewhere and teaching. And I loved it, absolutely loved it. Well, then 2020 hit and everything shut down with COVID.
Right.
Now I'm sitting at home. I can't go anywhere. And I love teaching. And so I could only mow my yard so much, and I'm kind of bouncing off the walls wanting something to do. And I drove to a lot of my training because I don't particularly care for flying. And I listen to podcasts a lot. That's kind of how I spent my time. And so I'm sitting at home going, I can do that. I'm going to do a podcast. And my goal was to do what I do in my classes is to just share information. And mostly I wanted to have a way for officers to start telling their own stories instead of letting Hollywood tell our story, instead of letting the media tell our story. I wanted to have a way for officers to tell stories. I wanted to tell officers, share with them what I had learned. I wanted to be able to have guests on that could share with them what they had learned. And so I sat down, pushed a button, and started recording. Now, my first couple of shows were bad. It was me rambling for an hour, but I had a company that I had worked with before. Actually, I had purchased some FTO software from them before. I knew them. They actually heard the podcast. They said, "Hey, Steve, we really like that. We want to sponsor you." I said, "Awesome. What's that mean?" They said, "We don't know." So they ended up hiring a professional producer for me, and that worked really well. So about the first year, I had a professional producer that kind of walked me through the process and taught me how to do this, taught me how to focus my attention and how to focus my episodes and how to put them together. And so that's where the Blue Canary came from. And I just started using that as a platform to teach and to share everything that I knew. And the Blue Canary people ask me where that comes from. Well, when I was a young officer, my first year of being at the Bloomington Police Department, I got sent to a hazmat class. So hazardous materials class, always put on by the fire department, because all the placards that you see on the tankers and the trucks around there, the fire department puts on the hazmat training. And of course, fire and police, we always have that nice rivalry between us and public safety. And I never forget sitting in that classroom where the instructor is pointing to the different placards and how you're supposed to stop and read these placards from a distance with your binoculars before you get too close. And he pretty much stopped and said, I don't have to do that. He said, when I show up to the scene, all I'm going to do is look and see all the dead blue canaries on the ground. So the canary in the coal mine, they used to carry the canaries down in the coal mine because they would be the barometer for oxygen. And once those canaries dropped, then you knew that you had a real problem and you had to get out of that coal mine right away. So he called us blue canaries because we were too stupid to read the placards. We're just going to roll right up trying to save people. When we get there, we're going to die. He's going to see that we've already died. So now he's going to keep an eye out. And that really stuck with me. And what I realized in my career was that cops, we're the barometer for society. We see everything before everybody else does. We see what's coming. We have to deal with these issues before everybody else does. And so that blue canary term, just like I said, it stuck with me, became important. And so that's why I named my Blue Canary Consulting as my training company, and the Blue Canary Podcast is to share all that information I have with anybody who was willing to listen. And I'm starting in season 5 now. So I've really enjoyed it. And I have 50 or 60 episodes out there and getting ready to drop a bunch more on leadership this year. So it should be fun.
Congratulations. 60 episodes. That's a long time. You're very committed to it. Do you usually have guests on, or is it more of a narrative podcast?
Both. Split it right down the middle. Half of my episodes in the season are going to be guests. And I've had everybody from Dave Grossman to Ed Morales to Vinny Montez. I've had some great instructors, great trainers, and people with great life experiences come on and talk. And then the other half are my monologues. I pick topics that I think are important that I want to talk about, and it's like a lot of the questions that you asked me, I have episodes on those. How do I know these numbers? Because I have episodes on those, and I actually dove down into them to figure it out. And so, I get to talk about it during those monologues, and then the other half are great interviews. So
that's very interesting. Congratulations. The Blue Canary Podcast, again, for anyone listening, you could find that on Google. Is it on Spotify?
Yeah, it should be anywhere you can listen to podcasts. I got on Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, pretty much all. It's in the nice RSS feed. So anybody that has a podcast that you like to listen to, the odds are really good you're going to find Blue Canary there.
Okay. And do you have a website for it as well?
Yeah, my website, not only for the podcast, but is for my training and teaching, is bluecanaryconsulting.com. And so if you go to bluecanaryconsulting.com, you'll find information about the podcast, schedules for me, classes that I have, that I offer. You can buy t-shirts if you want.
Thank you for sharing. What would you tell the current law enforcement officers listening to this episode? What message would you have for them?
It matters. Everything you do matters. When you get up every morning, when you put on that uniform, when you go into work, when you investigate that case, when you respond to that call, it all matters. See, the problem that we have is that the outside influences are beating us down. The internal stresses and struggles are dragging us down. And so what we find every single day is it is a fight to put that uniform on. It is a fight. And we don't have enough people telling us that it matters. Every single decision you do matters. And when you go out there, you are changing people's lives for the good. There is nothing finer you can do with your life than public safety. And there is nothing harder or finer than you can do with your life than to be a law enforcement officer.
And what would you tell those who are around my age on the fence about joining law enforcement or not? What message would you have for them, especially with the war on cops going on right now?
All of that extraneous stuff is not important. What is important is if you really want to make a difference, join, sign up, go out and do it, see what it's about. I think you're going to find yourself, anybody who's even thinking about law enforcement, especially in this day and age, they're going to find one of the most rewarding careers that you could possibly have. And it's, again, just like I'm telling those officers it matters, I'm telling the younger people, it's worth it. It's worth the arguments with the family. It's worth the hard training. It's worth the onboarding process. It's worth it.
How do we, as a community, how do we trust the badge in today's world?
I love the title, the Trust the Badge. I love the title of your podcast because
Thank you.
It's the challenge that we're facing. And what I would say is that, and when you look at the studies, most of the people do. trust the badge, the vast majority of people. But because of this terrible narrative that we have going around, we don't think that's the case. I think many people would be surprised that the faith that the public has in law enforcement is actually higher than almost any other institution in the United States. Even though we're the ones that are taking all of the pressure, we're the ones taking all of the criticism, we are much higher than almost any other institution. And how do we go about doing that? Trusting the badge. Well, first off, as a profession, we have to do better communicating with the people. We have to start sharing with the people our stories about what we do and why we do it. And we have to quit with the closed mindset or the I hate it when my brain quits working.
No
But
problem.
we just yeah, we have to quit with that whole we have to quit with that mindset of us versus them. And we really have to open up to our community. Now, at the same time, though, the community has to be willing to understand the importance of law enforcement, and they have to listen to us, because in many places they don't want to listen to us. They don't even want to allow us to have a voice. And so we have to kind of come at and meet in the middle from that communication side, is that the community has to listen to us and allow us to make statements and allow us to be part of that conversation. And at the same time, as officers, we have to be willing to have it. We have to be willing to sit there and have those conversations with the community so that we can all come to a better understanding of what we're trying to do here, which is just make the world a better place.
Again, for everyone that's listening, that's Blue Canary.
Yeah, bluecanaryconsulting.com. I train law enforcement. I train public safety. Yeah,
Okay.
Public safety training is what I do.
That sounds good. And so if any of you are interested, that's the website you go to. And then another podcast that you can listen to, Blue Canary Podcast, on all platforms, just like Trust the Badge, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, I'm sure. Go give that a listen. And thank you so much again, Mr. Kellams, for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Trust the Badge. Please follow @TrustTheBadge on Instagram for updates, and follow Trust the Badge on any podcast platform such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.